If you consider my current lifestyle, seen through the eyes of anyone from our distant past, people would say that I live like a king. But that's not true. I live like a deity, like a god, lowercase g. I'm sure that Henry VIII, Charlemagne, and King Tut would have happily traded in their crowns to have what I have. I have a motor vehicle, a nice hot shower, a collection of CDs and records, and an iPhone containing the knowledge of the world, and it fits in my pocket. I'm very thankful with the cards I've been dealt. I possess a Canadian passport. I live in the picturesque town of Dundas with good people in it, Exhibit A. I have a doctor on speed dial. This level of gratitude didn't come to me overnight. I learned it largely from two people, my mother and from Jesus Christ. I'll explain shortly. As a child complaining about a boring plate of pork chops and peas, my mother said, as did yours, I'm sure, eat what you've got, there are kids starving in Africa. But I couldn't get my young brain around that. I wanted SpaghettiOs. This brings me to my favorite expression of modern times, first world problems. The stewardess was so rude, she ruined our entire flight. I ordered Coke, but they brought Diet Coke. I hate Twitter, I always forget my password. For the first bunch of years that I sat in attendance at this very church, whenever Reverend Rick said the prayer, he would ask God for things. Silently, I said to myself, not me, I'm not asking for anything. How can I ask for more than what I already have? Even though Rick was asking for us and for other people, he asked for ethical things, to look over someone who's ill, for example. It sometimes bothered me seeing some of the ridiculous things people prayed for, things large and small, football players praying before the big game as if God isn't busy enough, the leaders of opposing sides of a war asking for God's favor. So I always felt that I couldn't ask for anything. It's not entirely true. When I was around 11, I prayed for the Star Wars movie to come earlier, but I like to think that I haven't asked for anything since then. Until 2004 and 2005, when my son and daughter were born. And so I prayed for one thing only: please look after my children. And that was when I struck my deal with God. I was literally on my knees when I said, look after my babies, keep them healthy. If you're going to send a disease towards my family, send it to me. How about that, eh? And then I continued to be thankful of a Sunday morning. I told Reverend Rick about the deal I'd struck with God. He smiled the way he does when he's about to share his wisdom with his flock. Steve, nobody negotiates with God, you know that. Our fate is in his hands. Last December, when I was at the Juravinsky Hospital getting a CAT scan, a young, pleasant nurse remarked what a miserable, rainy day it was, to which I replied, well, any day above ground is a good day, right? I knew the nurse was just making polite conversation, but I always felt that the weather shouldn't ruin your day unless your basement is rapidly flooding. I'm very fortunate in that I've been able to maintain a steady stream of happiness throughout a rained-out baseball game and even throughout some of the horrors of my cancer treatments. Many of you here possess the books I've written about my cancer journey. Although I wrote about the lighter, fun side of things, I need to say that there were many days and nights that were exceedingly difficult to withstand. In the midst of those nights on my hands and knees, my head in the toilet, feeling the sensation of being shot in the back with a handgun, every time I retched, I got through it by thanking God for sending cancer to me instead of those two. Ultimately, I'd be happy again by the morning. One of the many things that our mother taught my brother, sister, and me was that happiness was something that you made happen. As young kids, we'd watch over how our mother would declare in advance of some event or other that it would be great. We would never hear her say, "I sure hope we have a good time," as if the possibility of the good time were dependent on some external factor. At around age 12, I was at a friend's house, and his father ordered a pizza. When it became clear that the pizza was late, possibly owing to the fact that other people in Dundas wanted to order pizzas for themselves, the man became irritated and then quite angry. If I were an adult, I would have attempted to help him see the silliness, the fruitlessness of his emotions. But as a preteen, all I could do was wonder why the man was so upset. "It's just a pizza," I thought. Eventually, the apartment buzzer rang. My friend's dad scolded the delivery boy, paid him, and the feast was begun. I found it peculiar that what was required to make this man's evening a success was that the pizza not be late. It was just a pizza. So, what would you do if you knew you were going to die in 2 weeks? That very question was placed at my feet when I first received my diagnosis of kidney cancer 5 years ago. As it turned out, my actions over the next 2 weeks didn't change much. While waiting on surgery that I'd had only a 40% chance of surviving, I spent the fortnight with Isabel and the kids, playing board games and doing jigsaw puzzles. My bucket list had long ago been filled. Although I was incredibly saddened by the idea of leaving Isabel, Megan, and Blake behind, I was surprised to find that I wasn't particularly afraid of death. With no small amount of humility, I started hoping that an accounting of my past actions would be met with approval by St. Peter at the gate. I have some atheist friends with whom I've discussed the afterlife. They say we'll become nothing but dust. But is there a place where our souls will go, where we can reconnect with our ancestors? What about reincarnation, ghosts, and angels with harps? We don't have to agree, but what we do know is this: we will all experience the phenomenon of death. The certainty of an afterlife makes it a little easier to accept what happens when we go. In my mind, this leads to another opportunity to live a good life each day, start a new bucket list, and try to leave the world a bit better than when we arrived. Isabel remarks that I don't notice gardens or flowers or plants. She will point out the colors in the neighboring gardens when she and I go for walks, and she's perplexed about my ho-hum reaction. It's not that I don't recognize beauty, not at all. It's just that there are other things that I find beautiful, things that make me happy. For example, in my car I listen to music, as one does. Not long ago, the radio played the sweet vocal harmonies of Crosby, Stills, and Nash, singing a song that just suggests we all try to be nice to each other. Their voices were so sweet, the guitar so exquisitely played, the message was so powerful that I had no choice but to pull the car over, lest my weeping impair my driving. I don't notice flowers, but I find my own forms of beauty everywhere. My mother is here today. She and her 5 brothers and sisters grew up in northern Quebec. Their father, my grandfather, was once described as plus catholique que le pape, which translates to more Catholic than the Pope. Most of those times that he beat his children, it was done in the name of the Lord. Consequently, our family didn't spend a great deal of time at church. One Sunday morning, I believe it was 1979, my brother and I were playing on the cannon in front of the Dundas Town Hall. A full-size blue-painted school bus pulled up. The lady who was driving it opened the door and motioned us over. She asked if the 2 of us would like to go to church with her. She then pulled out a large bowl of jujubes and Snickers bars. "I've got candy," she said. Seconds later, my brother and I were on our way to a Pentecostal church in Hamilton, along with a busload of other children. It had not occurred to us to tell our mother where we were going. As it turned out, we returned home in time for lunch bearing pamphlets and with a pocket full of candy wrappers, thus concluding the church experience of our youth. 20 years later, Nurse Shirley, known as Shirley Crozier, to those who hadn't been patients of hers, introduced me to St. Paul's United Church in Dundas. I had planned to open up a children's music school in town, and Shirley convinced me to start it up here in the 4th floor Sunday school rooms. Over and above my need to make a living, part of my mandate was to provide some free music lessons and instruments to those who were without means. This was to be my way of paying it forward, inspired by Dundas folks who had helped my family when we were growing up here. The music school still carries on today, and I'm grateful to you all for letting that happen. Last year, I'd spent a solid 3 months in the hospital. My return to St. Paul's was met with another of Reverend Helen's inspiring sermons. After the service, I sat still in my wheelchair, trying to summon the energy to make it to the elevator. I felt like a bag of dirt. And I decided that if I died right then and there, well, that would be okay with me. Just then, a pair of arms was wrapped around me, and a lady's voice said, and I quote, "Darling, you look like you need a hug." Yeah. And so began the friendship between the Woods and the Partons. But this entire congregation has been wonderful to me. You've rallied around me through the births of my children, my marriage to Isabel, and you continue to support me in my cancer battle. Frederick has always been kind enough to let me play music here ever since I first arrived. Sometimes I played my classical guitar, which was largely met with praise, but on occasion I sang and played my electric guitar, a song from the 1960s with a thoughtful message. It turned out that not everyone was happy with my Fender Stratocaster. I once remarked to Reverend Rick that it seemed about 2% of the church was displeased when I played my electric guitar. To this, he replied, "Only 2%? Try writing a sermon. I'd be delighted if only 2% of the congregation was unhappy with my preaching." God love you, Rick. So back to Jesus. Whether you've read his book or seen any of his movies, you'll know that he had pretty much nothing. And yet he was thankful for what little he did possess. WWJD means, what would Jesus do? And WWMD means, to me at least, what would Mom do? Well, neither of them would get upset about a late pizza delivery. Thanks for listening.